The warning lights had been flashing red for 3 hours straight. Derek Ivan watched them blink through the grimy porthole of Docking Bay 3, each pulse casting bloody shadows across the metal floor. Another ghost ship had arrived in the night, drifting in from the dark void like all the others. Silent, empty, broken dot. Most of the cargo ships floating in from the outer edges were hollow shells now. Everyone knew what they really were, remnants from a war that nobody dared speak about out loud. The evidence was written in scorched metal and torn flags, in the dried blood that stained their empty decks, in the silence that followed them like a curse. Derek had seen dozens of these ghost ships dock at Argus 9. The station was supposed to be a maintenance hub, a place where healthy ships came for repairs. Instead, it had become something else entirely. A graveyard for broken machines and forgotten battles. A dumping ground for the wreckage of an empire that was slowly falling apart. The corridors of Argus 9 were darker now than they used to be. The air recycling systems wheezed and groaned like dying animals. The generators hummed with a sickly sound that echoed through the station's metal bones. Most of the crew had either transferred out, gone silent, or simply vanished without a word, which left Derek more or less alone in this floating tomb. He pulled up the cargo manifest on his handheld scanner. 3 standard shipping containers were listed for Docking Bay 3, all marked as empty, all logged as salvage equipment from a wrecked ship called Chariot's End. Standard procedure. It's nothing unusual, but something felt wrong. Derek had learned to trust his instincts over the years. They'd kept him alive through 2 system wars and countless station emergencies. Right now, those instincts were screaming at him to pay attention. He walked slowly around the 3 containers, his boots echoing on the metal floor. The first 2 looked normal, dented and worn, but nothing out of the ordinary. The third one, labeled 17B, was different. Older, bulkier, its surface was covered in black soot and burn marks, as if someone had tried to scrub it clean with fire. Derek stopped in front of container 17B and frowned. His hazel eyes studied every inch of its surface. The latch had been welded shut, but not by factory workers. The welding was sloppy, uneven, like someone had done it in a hurry. Or in secret. The artificial lights above him flickered with that familiar yellow glow that made everything look sickly. Derek circled the container again, looking for identification tags or barcodes. There were none. Just a freight code that had been half erased by a scary off-carbon scoring dot. Then he saw it in the upper right corner of the container's edge. Barely visible under layers of soot and damage was an emblem. A corporate logo that had been burned until it was almost unrecognizable. Derek leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. Triangle shape. The faint outline of something that had been deliberately destroyed. His chest tightened. The last time he'd opened something he wasn't supposed to, 3 people had ended up in the medical bay. One of them never came out. The official report called it a containment failure. Derek called it a mistake. A mistake he'd promised himself he'd never make again. But here he was, staring at another mystery container. Derek sighed and pulled out his override key. His thumb hovered over the latch panel for a long moment. Every rational part of his brain told him to walk away, to file a report with Central Command and let someone else deal with it. But Derek hadn't seen another living person in 11 days. The last voice he'd heard was a pre-recorded message telling him to keep working and maintain station integrity. He pressed his thumb to the panel and entered the manual override code. The container hissed as the locks disengaged. Cool vapor leaked from the seams, flowing across the floor like ghostly fingers. The door creaked open just an inch, then stopped. Derek could see nothing but darkness inside. A smell drifted out. Not the usual scent of rot or fuel that came from salvaged containers. This was something else. Burnt ozone mixed with sweat and old fear. The smell of something that had been trapped for too long. Derek waited. Nothing moved inside the container. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A breath. Soft, wet, and unmistakably real. His hand moved toward the plasma pistol. On his hip, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he crouched down slowly and peered into the dark space inside the container. At first, he saw only shadows and scattered debris. Food rations torn open, shredded blankets. Loose bolts and metal scraps. Scattered like bones. Then something shifted in the far corner. A figure huddled in the darkness like a forgotten child. Derek's breath caught in his throat as he saw her clearly for the first time. Her skin was a deep, rich green that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Almost metallic, like polished copper with an emerald tint. Her body was painfully thin, her limbs folded tightly against herself for warmth or protection. She blinked once, slowly, and Derek saw her eyes. They were the color of deep ocean water, luminous and bright. Wide with fear, but intelligent. Alert, her pupils contracted and expanded. Like a cat's, reactive and sharp. She was watching him with the stillness of a cornered animal, not pleading for mercy, but bracing for whatever would come next. Derek didn't speak at first. He could see that she was barely conscious, exhausted beyond measure. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest too sharp and quick. Her long black hair clung to her face in tangled waves, matted with dust and grime. Her body trembled, but Derek couldn't tell if it was from cold, hunger, or pure terror. Maybe all three. He looked at her neck, expecting to see the usual signs. A translator chip, an identification collar, ownership markings. Instead, he saw only faint scars that might have been from restraints. Old wounds that had healed badly. Derek swallowed hard. Someone had locked a living being in a cargo container, like a piece of equipment. Left her to die in the darkness while the ship drifted through space. The thought made him sick. He backed away from the container slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. From his supply pack, he pulled out a protein bar, sealed, clean, and nutrient. Not much, but better than the scraps of torn rations she seemed to have been surviving on. Derek placed the protein bar on the floor halfway between them, then backed away again. He kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. She stared at the food, her glowing eyes fixed on it with desperate hunger, but she didn't move. Minutes passed in silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of the station's failing generators and the soft whistle of air through the ventilation system. Derek waited patiently, not wanting to spook her. Finally, with a movement so slow it was almost painful to watch, she reached for the protein bar. Her fingers were long and elegant, clearly not human. But they fumbled with the wrapper like she'd never seen packaged food before. When she couldn't figure out how to open it, she bit into the edge with sharp teeth. The desperation in that gesture was quiet but unmistakable. She devoured the protein bar too quickly, choked once, and coughed violently. Then she froze, as if expecting to be punished for making noise. Derek knelt down and slid his water canteen toward her across the metal floor. "No one's going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Drink." She flinched at the sound of his voice, but grabbed the canteen with both hands. She drank like someone who didn't know when they'd see water again, tilting, her head back and draining nearly half the container in one go. When she finished, her shoulders sagged slightly, not from relaxation, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when your body finally realizes it might survive another day. Derek studied her features more carefully now. Her face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that might have been regal once. But malnutrition and stress had worn her down. Dirt and bruises marked her green skin like a map of suffering. The scars told their own story. Thin marks around her wrists and ankles from restraints. Healed burns on her arms. Deliberate cuts that spoke of captivity, not accident. She wasn't a stowaway who had hidden in the container by choice. She was a prisoner who had somehow survived transport across the void. Derek exhaled slowly, tasting the metallic flavor of recycled air. There were protocols for situations like this: emergency procedures, calls to Central Command, official channels to follow. But Derek hadn't seen another human face in almost 2 weeks. The last communication he'd received was that pre-recorded message telling him to continue salvage operations. This was just one more unlisted problem in a station full of broken things. Derek stood up and walked to the bay doors. He opened them with a soft hiss of hydraulics. "Come on," he said quietly, not looking back at her. "You can't stay in there." She didn't answer, didn't move. Derek walked through the doorway and waited in the corridor outside. He listened to the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant groaning of the station's aging systems. Then he heard a soft scuffing sound behind him. She was there, just inside the threshold, barefoot on the cold metal floor, still clutching the empty water canteen to her chest like a shield. Her glowing eyes watched him carefully, not trusting him, but not running away either. She was testing him, trying to decide if he was another threat or something different. Derek looked back into the container and noticed something he'd missed before. In the corner where she'd been hiding, something metallic glinted under the torn blankets. He crouched down and brushed the fabric aside. It was a collar, or what was left of one. The metal had been burned through, the clasp destroyed. Someone had scraped away the serial numbers, trying to erase any trace of ownership or origin. Derek picked up the broken collar and turned it over in his hands. When he looked up, he saw that she was watching him. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe? Or remembrance of pain. He let the collar fall to the floor with a soft clatter. "Let's find you a place to sleep," he said, nodding toward the corridor. She didn't respond with words, but she began to follow him. Her footsteps were silent as shadows on the metal floor. Her green skin was streaked with old bruises that looked like storm clouds. Her black hair trailed behind her like smoke. And her eyes, those bright, intelligent eyes, were like broken glass that somehow still held light. Derek didn't know who she was, didn't know where she'd come from or what species she belonged to, didn't know what she might do or what kind of danger he'd just invited into his lonely station. But he couldn't leave her locked in that metal box like cargo. Maybe, he thought, as they walked through the dim corridors of Argus 9. Helping her was the first genuinely good thing he'd done in years. The air filtration system in Sector 6C was acting up again. Derek slid his hand beneath the plastic access panel and worked it loose with his screwdriver, moving slowly and carefully. When the cover came off, he frowned at what he saw inside. The filter was dark with mold and decay. Fibrous growth had spread across its surface like a disease. Probably contamination from another decomposing freighter, or maybe something worse. The air that Argus 9 breathed was getting thicker and more toxic every day, just like everything else on this forgotten station. Derek set his screwdriver down with a quiet clink and leaned back against the corridor wall. He ran his fingers through his hair, scraping away sweat and grime. He could smell himself oil, metal, and exhaustion. He hadn't taken a proper shower in days. Hell, he'd almost forgotten what clean felt like. But he hadn't forgotten about her. The green-skinned woman was still in the small room he'd given her, just a few corridors away. Silent and still, at least according to his sensors. He pulled out his portable monitor and checked the motion detector he'd discreetly installed in her room. She was still there, but barely moving. The door had been left unlocked. She could have run at any time. Was that trust, or was she just too exhausted to flee? Derek couldn't give her a name yet. In his mind, she was still just the girl, this mysterious shape he couldn't quite categorize. Green skin, black hair, clearly humanoid, but definitely not human. Something in between, something new. But her humanity, if that was the right word, went deeper than appearance. Her hunger had been real. Her caution was real. And those eyes, Derek couldn't forget those bright ocean-colored eyes. There hadn't been just fear in them. There had been defiance, too. The flicker of something that refused to give up completely. Derek reached over and tapped the food dispenser terminal embedded in the wall. He ordered a hot meal from the nutrition unit, something simple but rich in calories and vitamins. When the container dropped into the delivery tray, steam was already rising from the surface. Derek lifted it carefully with both hands and headed toward her room. The door slid open with barely a whisper. Cool air drifted out like breath that had been held too long. She was still on the floor where he'd left her hours ago, but she'd moved, no longer facing the wall in complete withdrawal. Now she was turned toward the narrow bed, as if she'd been considering whether to use it. Her head didn't lift when he entered, but Derek saw the subtle signs that she knew he was there. The slight tensing of her shoulders, the change in her breathing pattern. She was always listening, always aware. Derek didn't just set the food down and leave this time. Instead, he pulled up a maintenance stool and sat down beside her on the floor. He opened the meal container, releasing more steam into the cool air. The smell was simple but appetizing, some kind of protein stew with vegetables. Derek stirred the meal with the provided spoon and took a bite himself, casual, unhurried. Then he held the container out toward her, leaving the spoon inside. A gesture of sharing, not charity. Her head turned slowly, first toward the food, then toward him. There was no panic in her eyes this time, but there was still suspicion. She was watching him carefully, waiting to see what he really wanted, testing his intentions. Derek took another bite and said nothing. He simply met her gaze and gestured with a slight nod toward the food, an invitation, not a command. She didn't move at first. Derek could see her thinking, weighing her options, trying to read his motivations. Then, with careful and deliberate control, she began to crawl forward. Not with desperate hunger like before, but with an eerie kind of dignity. She was choosing to approach him. She settled on her knees within arm's reach and took the meal container from his hands. But instead of using the spoon, she carefully placed both hands around the bowl and tilted it to her lips. She drank in small, quiet sips, each one measured and reverent. Derek realized suddenly that this wasn't just about feeding herself. This was a ritual, not driven by desperation, but by respect. She was treating the meal and his gesture with a kind of ceremony that spoke of deeper customs and beliefs. When she finished, she lowered the container slowly. Before letting go completely, she dipped her head slightly in what could only be gratitude. Not the frantic thanks of a starving prisoner, but the formal acknowledgement of one intelligent being to another. Derek didn't speak, simply inclined his own head in response, as if saying, "You're welcome," without words. Started to rise from the stool, thinking the meal was over. Then he heard it, a voice, barely audible, soft as the steam still rising from the empty food container. Run. Just one word, but it hung in the room like something sacred and broken. There was no context, no explanation. It's just that single word falling into the silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Derek froze, his eyes locked with hers. She didn't look away at first. For a moment they stared at each other across a gap that seemed infinite. Then, slowly, she turned her head away, pulled her knees up to her chest, and curled in on herself like a flower closing against the cold. She hadn't run. But Derek could see that the urge still lived inside her, coiled and waiting. The instinct to flee was so strong that it was the first word she'd chosen to speak to him. What had they done to her? What kind of hell had she escaped? From that made running her first and only thought. Derek stood up quietly and moved toward the door. "I'll be back," he said softly. "You don't have to run. Not here." He didn't know if she believed him. But as he left the room, Derek made himself a promise. Whatever had happened to her before, whatever had put those scars on her body and that fear in her eyes, it wouldn't happen again. Not on his station, not while he was still breathing. The corridors of Argus 9 seemed a little less empty as he walked back to his repairs. For the first time in months, Derek wasn't completely alone. To Run, she had said, but to whom from what maybe she'd said it before, Maybesh screamed it in places where no one listened maybe. Someone had once listened and didn't make it Derek. Stepped forward, picked up the empty container he didn't expect. Gratitude, he didn't need it, but the doorway he paused, turned back him. Here, he said softly, if you ever have to run again this time. Someone will run with you. The door whispered closed behind him, and as he stepped into the corridor, something in his chest loosened it much, but enough a thread had been tied between two people with no historiano. Promises and no names for what they were, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The lights in the maintenance bay flickered. Again, Derek stood on a narrow scaffold 30 feet above the cargo floor, recalibrating the motion sensors that had stopped logging after the last solar flare. The tool in his hand buzzed faintly, its readings jumping with every minor vibration the station's. Bones were old, rusted in places, even the welders had given up on every hiss of hydraulics or hum of power through. Miss Oligdan conduits sounded more like breath than machinery. Now living, wheezing Butareric wasn't listening to the machine, he was listening for footsteps ever since she'd spoken just one word. Something had shifted in the air, not just tension but awareness. He moved through the station now like he wasn't alone. As if each breath he took was being measured against silence. In a room 2 corridors away. She hadn't spoken since, but she'd started watching him more openly this morning. He passed the hydroponics viewport and found her there, standing barefoot, her green skin dappled with a filtered amber light, studying Thieslow. Drip of nutrient tubes sliding down glass columns. She hadn't turned when he approached, but she hadn't fled either. Progress, he didn't speak to her. Instead, had refilled one of the nutrient packets, adjusted a water flow, then walked away, let her see. Him fixing things, let her see what kind of man he was without saying a word. Now balanced above the bay floor, he adjusted the last node and reset the system with a slow press of his glove. The console chimmed faint and clean. One task done, another 100. Waiting, he descended the ladder and stretched his shoulder. The old injury from the pipe burst last year still ocked in the cold as he walked through the corridor toward the commons. The lights buzzed again. This time they didn't flicker from power. They flickered from movement. He paused at the junction and turned. She was there in the middle of the corridor, not hiding, just standing. Her bare feet were silent against the steel floor. She wore the spare jumpsuit he'd left for her, a size 2. Large sleeves rolled up, the material clung unevenly to her lean frame, but she didn't seem to mind her black hair, waskly and now combed back behind. Her shoulders still wet from the shower, she looked like someone trying to be part off-world again. He didn't move. He knew better than to rush. Her teal eyes studied him. No longer sharp with fear, but not soft either, alert, intelligent, curious. Then, without a word, she took a step forward. In another, he stayed still. She walked past him, slow, careful, and stopped at the corner, turning her head halfway, not looking back, just pausing, an invitation. He followed. They reached the commons. A rounded hub of old seating units, dusty screens, and a view of the planetoids spinning below. This place had once been a gathering point. Engineers eating, laughing, arguing before war pulled them all away. Now it was just shadows and silence. She stepped toward the viewport and pressed a hand to the thick glass. The planet below spun slowly, bathed in copper. Gold light, frozen surface, no atmosphere, just rock and reflection. He watched her quietly, then said, "It's dead down there. Alwatia's been." She turned her head slightly, not quite answering. "I've been on the station almost 3 years." He continued, "Visicom 15 months. Since anyone last docked here for longer than 5 minutes." Finally looked at him, that quiet intelligence in her gaze again. He rubbed the back of his neck. "You said, run back in the room. What did you mean?" Her brow tensed just enough for him to see it. She hesitated, then pointed upward past the viewport toward the stars. "Run Frankter." He asked a pause, then the slightest nod. Derek's jaw tightened. "You came from ship. No answer, but her expression changed her lips. Pressed tighter, her hand dropped from the glass, stepped closer, but kept his tone soft. Did they lock you in that? Crate, her arms folded across her chest, not defensive contained, his voice lowered. You don't think to say anything, not until you want to, but I need to know if someone's looking for you. That got a reaction, shout at him sharply, and then, for the first time she spoke again, 3 words shelting, accented, but clear, no one comes. It was a voice scraped raw from disuse, like her throat still hadn't forgiven her for making sound, but landed with weight. He stared at her. What do you mean? She looked down, whispered again, burned ship, all gone. Silence felt like Accutane between them. She didn't cry, her face didn't even change, but the muscles in her jaw told him enough. She'd seen something no one should. He sat down on one of the old chairs, the cushion hissing with age. You were the only survivor. She nodded once, then slowly walked toward him. He didn't expect what came next. She reached into the neckline of the jumpsuit and pulled something out, a fragment of metal charred and warped on a thin black cord. She held it out. Tohim, he took it carefully, turning it over in his hand. A ship's insignia, mossily melted, but he could still make out the edge of crest. Sharp lines, corporate, maybe medical, maybe military, he couldn't tell. Whatever organization it once belonged to had tried to erase it. He looked back at her. They tried to hide what happened to you. She didn't nod this time, but she didn't deny it either. He handed the fragment back. Her fingers brushed his when she took it. They both felt it. A connection, unspoken, uncomfort, human. She sat across from him, not too close, just enough for a long time. They said nothing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm Derek. He said simply, that's my name. She stared at him, then down at her own hands. When she looked back up, there was the faintest hint of challenge in her eyes, and then she whispered, Alari. The next morning, garived in fragments, faint light from the artificial day cycle filters, the soft hum of pressurized pipes behind the walls. The subtle creak of metal expanding in the station's cold-skinned. Derek lay awake long before his internal clock. Bust's sleep had come in snatches, every dream shadowed by the way Ari had said her name the night before, hesitant as if the sound of it could still betray her. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, the old scar along his ribs sacking faintly. That injury wasn't from an accident, it was from the day the station lost power during a routine repair cycle when his younger sister Aliyah had still been on board. It had happened fast, a miscalculated load balance. A coolant overflow and amagnetic pulse discharge through the midsection of the station. He'd made it out of the maintenance shaft with secondary burns. Derek hadn't spoken her name in months. Your smabe, not even out loud, but Rory had reminded him of something. He'd tried to bury that instinct to protect, to repair, not just systems, but people, and maybe that's what scared him the most. He found her in the commons again, seated where had left her, as if she hadn't moved all night. Gosh. She was watching the stars, not thudded rock below, not the interior of the station. Just the distant, silent canvas beyond the glass. Her posture was relaxed in a way that surprised him, back straight. Hands in her lap as if waiting for something to arrive that never would. He approached without a word and sat beside her this time. The silence didn't press in like a threat, it just was. Just spoke first. I used to think stars meant safety. Her voice was still soft, words unfamiliar on her tongue, but steady. Derek glanced at her, and now no, they look like gates. She looked at him, then locked once he let the meaning settle. You were born on a ship. She nodded. A vessel not built for war. Not built for freedom either. We weren't crew, we were assigned to who. Her gaze drop a toe. Those who could pay the pieces began to align the crate, the collar, the emblem scars. You were property, he said. Quieter than he meant to know, she replied immediately. I was told I was, but I never believed it. There was no anger at her voice, no self-pity, just calm defiance like a steel rod beneath silk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What did you get out? A pause. Then the fire wasn't an accident. His breath caught her eyes, didn't flinch. There were others we planned, not all of them want to go. Some had forgotten how to want, and you escaped. I burned a room, things stored ease in. She said it with a quiet resolve of someone who had made peace with But by then, only I was still Alavadiric. Didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine what it would take to do. What she had done, the grief it must have carved out of her, the silence it left behind my sister, he said, suddenly surprising himself. Aaliyah, she was 17. She died on the station. Rolari looked at them, not with pity, but recognition. There was a system malfunction. I was running diagnostics. In Section B, she was helping in the coolant bay. She wanted to Pravesh could handle the pressure. Valves, I should have stopped her. I didn't. She didn't make it, the words. Tasted bitter old, dusted with guilt that never washed off. She trusted me, he added, and I failed her. Rolari reached out, not far, not a full touch, but her fingers brushed his wrist. Light as breath. You didn't fail, she said. You're still here. That's not failure. He didn't reply, but he didn't pull away. Either she withdrew her hand respectfully, as if sensing that too much kindness too fast could be overwhelming. Gouged. A small comet passed by the viewport, its icy tails scattering through black like a trail of dust across glass. He broke the silence with a half smile and never asked if you even wanted to stay. Rolari tilted her head slightly. Where would I go? I don't know. There's a transport lane 5 light-years out. Eventually, a scavenger ship might swing close enough for a signal bounce. She shook her head. Freedom isn't about movement, it's about choice. He considered Red thought, then with a nod, accepted it. Do you want to help? With diagnostics today. I'll show you how the auxiliary circuits are routed through the forward relay. It was a practical offer, a neutral loan, but her expression changed. Subtle but clear, she stood almost too quickly, and for the first time, Derek saw what might have once been pride in her posture. I'd like that, she said. They walked together through the corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against metal as they entered. There lay Derek handed her a pair of gloves and a tool set. She looked at him. He caught her hesitation. You don't need permission to use them, he said. Not here. That smile, it wasn't quite a smile, but close touched the corners of her mouth together. They knelt by the open panel. He showed her thesystems. She learned fast, too fast, like someone who had once been punished for being clever, and now was free to prove it. Hours passed. The lights dimmed, tosical evening casting long shadows through the corridor, and as they packed up the tools, Rari did something next. She reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Derek's forehead. Just once, a soft, deliberate gesture, not flirtation, not gratitude, just contact, mutual, human. He didn't speak, didn't Ito, because in that moment something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not instant, but certain. She was no longer just a rescued stranger, and he was no longer just the man who opened the crate. They were both somehow beginning again. Alert arrived like a whisper, so soft the station didn't even flash. Read just a muted ping on the far right panel of Derek's central console. A proximity flag, then a docking override command. A accident, not a glitch. Someone had entered Argus 9's outer field with authorization. They shouldn't have. Derek's blood ran cold. He slid his fingers over the controls, pulling up the approach vector. A small class vesselite, fast, minimal life support, UWC property retrieval division. He closed his eyes for the space of a breath. Then he stood. By the time he reached the corridor, the station had already begun a subtle reaction, power diverting, backup systems, spooling pressure, levels adjusting in docking ring C. He didn't have to check where she was. Rolari was already there, standing in the hall like a shadow come to life. Her body still posture-centered, hair drawn back tightly. Her eyes met his without flinching. They found us, she said. He gave a slight nod, then stepped close. They're fast. I didn't expect movement for another week. Neither did I. Her voice was calm to calm, and he hated how used to this she must be, how natural it was for her to recognize this kind of intrusion without asking questions. How many, she asked. 3 on sensors. Could be more. Inside light boarding vessel, no beacon. They docked through Arm C. Manual override. That means the know your systems means they know you, he said, and that came out harsher than he meant. She didn't take offense, just nodded slowly, eyes scanning down the corridor. We need to decide fast. Hess said, I can seal the docking ring reroute, power stall them, but not for long, I've already prepped the vent ladder at deck 5 and I disabled the motion relays near the secondary supply hold. She glanced. Atham, you're not the only one who's been planning. Derek blinked. It hit him. Then not just how observant she'd been, but how quietly capable. She hadn't waited for orders. She'd adapted, prepared good, he said. Then we stall them hard. Give us a window. Her hand brushed his arm, brief grounding. If it comes to it, we separate. No, Derek. No, he repeated, voice steady. We've both been alone long enough. If we go down together, eh? Pause, then she turned toward the console, keyed in a lockdown command, and rerouted Rondentant. Flow away from docking ring C. She didn't look back, but her voice softened. Then let's make them regret ever stepping foot on this station. The docking sequence completed with a muted hiss and a thud that vibrated through the bulkheads like a dull heartbeat. Derek and Rory stood side by side in the narrow space between the old gravity battery chambers, barely 10 m from the hatch where the retrieval team would enter. 3 figures emerged from the mist, gray, sleek suits, visors reflective and blank corporate precision, molded into human shape. No insignia, no fisses, just authority with a trigger. One lifted a scanner, unauthorized life signatures logged. Priority asset located, commencing recovery. No introductions, no acknowledgement of Derek. Standing there unarmed, he stepped forward anyway. This station is under quarantine protocol, Hellied. You're trespassing under emergency lock if you don't have Heil override dual, be listed as rogue. The lead agent didn't even pause. Override confirmed. Article 9 subsection 3. We are within retrieval bounds. You're not within. Minithat earned a glance. We're not here for you this second, said a woman's voice, mechanical. Through the visor, we're here for the escape. Bu designated Delta 47. She's not a unit, then she shouldn't be marked. And with that, they moved. No negotiation, just for momentum. One scanned, another advanced. The third covered. Relari was already gone. They hadn't even seen her slip into the shadowed maintenance shaft. Derek triggered the first overload from his wrist pad, just enough to short the lights above them. Sparks burst. The hallway dimmed. The lead agent raised a weapon, non-lethal, but high charge. He ducked, rolled, and dropped a flash charge behind a support beam. The corridor filled with smoke. Plan E. Her voice crackled in his earpiece, revised. Plan O was improvise. He heard her laugh just once. Quick, it steadied him. Relay activated. The pressure valve near corridor 7 forcing airflow. Backward debris whipped through the fog as the agent staggered. One dropped to 1. Knee visor cracked by falling shrapnel. The second advanced anyway. Derek moved toward the far wall, felt the burn in his shoulders scream with the effort. He grabbed the backup power tool, hefty, blunt, and utterly analog, and swung. The agent went down, breathing hard. Derek turned back toward the corridor where the last figure disappeared. Gone, Relari, he said, coughing through smoke. Report. Silence, Relari. Then her voice. One got past me. He's heading forth Central Nexus, he cursed. They'll access the NAV logs. Our shuttle escape vector. I'm already there. Don't engage. But the line cut out by the time reached the Nexus. One of the agents lay collapsed near the door, limbs twitching from a disabled shock weapon. The other Rory stood over him, her foot and his chest hand pressed through his visor with a crackling salvage. Conduit man didn't move. She looked up at Derek. Her face was flushed, breath fast, but eyes steady. He said, They've been tracking us since the crate opened. Derek stepped forward, jaw tight. How long until they send more? He didn't know, but the signal's out. They know I'm alive. You're not just alive, Derek said quietly. You're free, and that scares them. She dropped the conduit and walked him. Her fingers touched the collar of his shirt, sliding down the fabric as if confirming he was real, intact. I don't want to run anymore, she whispered. Then we fight smarter, he said. We disappear on our terms. Relari nodded slowly, already rerouted the teams. Shuttle, I've been working on its old stealth coil since the 3rd day. He stared at her, Joe hot. I don't sleep much, she said simply. He laughed low and breathless. Remind Menet to underestimate. You again, you already stopped underestimating me, she said. That's why I'm still here. They didn't speak after that. There was no need to not, when everything between them had already been decided without words. They secured the unconscious retrieval agents and the cryocambers rewired the emergency signal repeaters and wiped the local logs. No distress call, no trace. Cirgus 9 would remain a silent ghost in orbit, just as forgotten as they once were. As Derek sealed the last pressure hatch, Rari approached him quietly as Mel tool clutched in her hand. I've been working on the shuttle stealth coil, she said. He blinked. You what is start on day 3? You were still sleeping off the first injury, I figured. Def. They came back. We might only get one jump. He looked at the coil modulator, primitive rigged. But functional. Of course you did, he murmured, lips twitching into something like a smile. She tilted her head. You're not Serper not anymore. They spent the next day in a haze of motion, silently preparing no speeches, no plans. Etched in stone, only shared breath, timed glances, and the growing awareness that every move they made was a step towards something else. When the stars finally aligned for the launch window, they didn't hesitate. They left together, and Argus 9 watched them go. A holomakine, exhaling its last breath into a silence that now belonged to someone else. 3 rotations where no red lights blinked, no scanners chirped with proximity threats, just stars. Cold, vast, and concerned, the shuttle moved through an abandoned shipping corridor mapped only in forgotten UWC logistics files. And long since abandoned by freighter crews, no one came here anymore, which made it perfect. Derek sat in the co-pilot chair, reviewing life support balances, while the low thrum of the engine fell at the silence across from him. Rari lay curled near the auxiliary console, dozing lightly under a folded thermal wrap. She hadn't slept easily at first, but now her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and for the first time in years, so did his. Across from him, Rari crouched Bezadeth, unconscious retrieval agent. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable as she retrieved the pressure searing and checked its charge. Her movements were mechanical at first, reflexive. But then they slowed. She looked at Derek. You're bleeding. He gave a weak grin. Good to know. I'm not a machine, but the pain was real and the blood soaking through his sleeve even more. So she crossed the distance between them without hesitation, kneeling. Basidia May, her fingers grazed the edges of his torn uniform. Let me see. He didn't protest. The fight had drained the last of his defiance. He tilted to one side and let her peel the fabric away, exposing a deep plasma burn along his upper shoulder. Angry red tissue, already blistering. Relar didn't flinch. She retrieved a medkit from the emergency wall panel, unlatched it with quick familiarity, and drew out the burn sealant and wound patcher. The way her hands moved wasn't guesswork. You've done this before, he said, trying to distract himself from the sting as she applied the sealant. She nodded. They trained us. Some of us were designated multi-use. Healing was part of the design. He looked at her, really looked at the sharpness in her jaw, the evenness of her breath, the way she didn't hesitate in pain or precision. Multi-use had muttered that what they called you in their records? Yes, her voice was even. Not on my face. Derek clenched his jaw, not from pain this time, but from something deeper. Anger, grief, guilt by association that she had ever been treated like that. Trained not for survival, but for compliance. She finished dressing his shoulder and wiped her hands on the edge of her sleeve. You need to rest. Your blood pressure is unstable. He started Torg, but her look stopped him. It wasn't hard, just firm, a quiet refusal. Toll him pretend he was fine. He gave a nod and let her help him up. They moved slowly through the corridor, their Trieval team unconscious behind them, the station lights flickering overhead. Like dying stars, she supported him. Morethan, he would have liked to admit, guiding him down the emergency ladder shaft and into the maintenance quarters inside. The room was quiet, dimly lit by the auxiliary power strip along Thefler. It smelled of grease and metal, a machinery too old to be efficient, but too stubborn to die. Rolari helped them sit on the cot, then turned to check the status feed on the wall console. They're locked down, she said after a moment. Docking clamps overridden their ship. Can't disengage without manual lift. You bought us time. He leaned back, letting cool of the wall press into his skin. Time's all I ever buy. She looked at him from across the room, then slowly walked toward him. Her pace wasn't hesitant, but there was a gravity to it, as if she were deciding something. With each step, I used to believe I was made for obedience, Ski said. To serve to Buhat someone else needed. He met her eyes. You're not that anymore. I'm not sure I ever was, she said, but I live like I was. It was safer Derek didn't speak the weight of her words. It was enough heckled Syed the battle behind her. Calmed the years of silence, hiding a fire she'd recently let burn. Then, unexpectedly, she sat beside him close, not touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin against his arm. Why did you stay? She asked. You could have handed me over. They wouldn't have questioned you. You could have walked away. He exhaled slowly. Because I've already lost someone, because I know what it's like to feel helpless, and because you walked out of that crate like you still had something worth saving. She turned to him. So did you. He blinked, Shirish out gently, no flinch, no hesitation, and laid her hand on his thick. Intact was light, but deliberate, her skin cool and soft against his callous palm. Carried something wordless, not gratitude, not apology, something creator a choice. He didn't pull away, in fact. He turned his hand to thread his fingers through hers. For a while they sat like that, no words, just two people trying to remember what closeness felt like, without threat, without command, without consequence. The tension between them wasn't heavy, it was electric. Not sexual, not yet. But there was an intimacy in the stillness and the quiet understanding that this moment was different. It wasn't about survival anymore, it was about connection. She leaned her head gently against his good shoulder. You're still warm, she murmured. That's good. He smiled faintly, still breathing too. I noticed Aquiat laugh pass between them. I don't know how this ends, he said after a while. One of them come when they find this place for real. We make them wish they hadn't, she said softly. He looked down at her, at the way her hair caught the soft light, at the way her jaw tightened when she talked about facing them. Again, you're not afraid. I am, she admitted, but fear doesn't stop me anymore. She shifted slightly, lifting her head to meet his gaze, and then, without ceremony, she kissed him. It wasn't the kiss of desperation or passion. It was slow, intentional, the kiss of Samayan. Reclaiming their right to feel, he kissed her back with equal gentleness, his fingers brushing her jaw, his breath catching not from the wound this time, but from the sheer vulnerability of it. When they parted, she stayed close, not to seduce, not to protect, just to be, and in that quiet, fractured space between recovery and everything that still waited beyond the station's walls, they sat side by side, to people no longer servive, but choosing for the first time to simply exist together. 3 days shave passed since they left Argus 9 behind. The stars out here were a colder, sharper, somehow uncaring points of light over a dark sea that stretched endlessly in every direction. Derek had forgotten how still space could be. No alarms, no broken circuits, no breathing walls, just quiet, real quiet. The shuttle hummed beneath their feet, old but steady systems, purring fuel cells holding. They'd been traveling along an abandoned maintenance corridor between trade routes, offered off signal and off everyone's radar. It was the first time either of them had felt untraceable free. Derek stood in the command bay, hands resting against the edge of the NAV console outside the viewport. A thing in the blackness, small, ringed with dusty ice, just outside any trade border, not on any populated chart. Not valuable enough to colonize. Perfect. He didn't her approach, but he felt her presence. Like gravity, Rellery moved differently now. Not like a ghost, not like someone trying to disappear into corners. She walked like she belonged in her skin, every step, sure, unhurried. She was wearing soft faded coveralls, rolled at the sleeves, her black hair tied loosely at the base of her neck. Her green skin shimmered in the dim light of the console readouts. He turned toward her, offering a small nod. She held orbit, where Sable Relari stepped beside him and studied the planet. It looks dead, it is, but the sub-layer might be warm enough to build shelter. There's geothermal activity under the crust, she glanced. Adam brow slightly arched. Planning a homestead, Derek, He smiled, no planning to disappear for a while. Thought you might want to help. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her palm against the viewport, watching the pale glow off the planet refract across her fingers. I've been free for 3 days. She said softly, but I'm still trying to understand what that means. He looked at her, really looked, not at her beauty, not at her aliveness, but at the person standing beside him, at the woman who had once been locked in a crate and no stood unshackled, choosing her own future. I don't think freedom feels like fireworks, Derek said. I think it feels like having time to breathe and no one standing over you. Her eyes met his. It also feels like knowing you could levitate, being asked to stay. A silence bloomed between them, not awkward, just full. I don't need you to stay, he said, but I want you to, I know, and not by Kosu owe me anything. I know that too. She stepped closer. I don't owe you, but I'm choosing you. The words settled into him like warmth from the inside out. He reached for her hand, not to lead, not to take, but to hold, and she let him. Later that night, the shuttle cabin dimmed a night cycle. The stars continued drifting silently outside, and the soft vibrations of the ship's power systems became a kind of lullaby. Rolari sat on the bedroll they had laid out together on the cabin floor, combing her fingers through her hair. Derek stood nearby, adjusting cabin's thermal settings. The air was cool now, but not cold, comfortable. When he turned, she was watching him, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet affection that made his chest ache. She reached out a hand. Come here. He Croset's room slowly sank down beside her. They didn't speak for a while. She leaned her head on his shoulder, letting her body rest against his. You've been carrying something heavy for a long time, she said. He didn't deny it. I thought it was guilt, she continued, but it's not just that, it's loneliness. He turned to her, surprised. She nodded. I know that feeling. He let silence answer for him. Then he said, I don't feel it as much anymore. She looked up at him. Neither do I. And then she kissed him. There was no tension, no rush, just quiet fire, slow and deliberate. Hands slid along her waist. Hers moved into his hair. Their bodies pressed together, soft heat against cold, whilst they moved. With patience, reverence, he undressed her, slowly revealing the lineage of her body with careful fingers. She guided his shirt off with ease, nothing mechanical, nothing rehearsed, just them. Rolari lay back, pulling him down, whither her breath hitched. When his lips brushed her collarbone, she arched into his touch, not to give anything away, but because she wanted to meet him there. He kissed her neck, her shoulders, the hollow just above her heart. She wasn't trembling anymore. She held him with strength, one arm wrapped behind his back, other threading through his fingers. Her legs wrapped around him, and when their bodies joined, there was no hesitation, no apology. They moved together like a language written in touch, like gravity pulling to Bodhiacinto. One path. When they reached that quiet, shattering stillness, neither spoke, not right away. They simply stayed pressed against each other's hearts, slowing together, skin damp with heat breath, mingling in the small space between them. Later, as they lay curletto gather under a single thermal blanket, Rory spoke. You know what the humans used to call that planet? He blinked, barely awake. What? She smiled against his chest. They didn't. It's never be animated. He exhaled, voice raspy. Then let's name it ourselves. What should we call? I've thought for a moment. Then Sanctum. She repeated it quietly. Sanctum. It wasn't just the name of a place. It was a declaration, a promise. This was no longer about surviving. They had survived now. It was about living. Together, the stars looked different when you weren't running the shuttle, drifted in low orbit over a nameless moon, its atmosphere inhabit, its surface cold and still, but inside the vessel, the warmth was a mystical. Derek sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the curved bulkhead, watching Rolari move through small space with the ease of someone no longer afraid to exist. They've been free for 5 days, no alarms, no chase signals, no shadows in the sensors, just silence, just them. Rolari knelt near the central heating unit, her skin tinted gold by the soft emergency lighting. She had removed the upper layer of her station suit hours ago. Now dressed in aplane black tank top and soft cargo pants, her dark braid loose her shoulders. For the first time since he'd met her, her green skin shimmered faintly in the low light. She wasn't alien to him anymore. She was real, and she was looking at him with a kind of gaze that held no defense. "No doubt, just want Derek," she said softly, walking toward him. He stood as she approached Shed. She reached out and touched his chest, stopping him. Her fingers spelled across the fabric of his shirt, then slid beneath, resting over his heartbeat. "I need to know something," said he, nodded, breathing carefully. "Anything, are you with me? Because I'm here, or because you me?" His throat tightened, and not from nerves, from the sheer weight of the question. The vulnerability it carried. Here it stopped and cradled her face gently. "Like something sacred. I'm with Yabi. Because when I look at you, I see the person who saved me from being numb. You could have left me behind in every way, but you didn't." Her eyes glistened. But she didn't cry. She leaned into his palm. "Then be with me," she whispered, "not to take, not to fix, just to feel." Has stepped closer, their mouths met slowly, not urgent, not desperate, just deep, open, real. She tasted of heat and breath, of sleepless nights and silent promises. Her hands pulled him closer, and he let the wall between them dissolve completely. They moved together toward narrow bed in the aft quarter, wordless. Now his shirt hit the floor. She slid her tank top over her head, the light painted shadows on her skin, lush, vibrant, alive. He kissed her shoulder first, then her neck, then lower. Every touch was met with breath, every breath with a tremor. She wasn't fragile. She guided him, moved with him. Her body learning his, inviting his weight, his warmth, his presence, not out of duty, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. He explored her slowly, reverently. She wassailed contrast, soft curves, and honed strength, vulnerability, and unspoken comment. When she arched into him, he held her like gravity. When she whispered his name, he whispered hers back, Relari. It was the first time he said it in a moment like this, and she smiled when she heard it, half-lidded. Breathless, they joined, as if they'd always been building to this moment. Not rushed, not perfect, but honest. When it was over, they stayed wrapped in each other, her head on his head, his arms cradling her body like a memory he never wanted to release. Chase spoke, first voice barely audible against his skin. "I never thought I'd be touched like that and feel safe." He kissed the top of her head. "You're not just safe, Rory. You're free." She closed her eyes, pressing herself closer. "So are you." And in the hush that followed, with no light chasing them, no doors between them, and no systems dictating who they were allowed to be, Derek finally understood what it meant to belong, not to a place, but to someone.